She could hear their boots before she saw them. Dust curled into the air like breath held too long. 3 men in broad hats, leather boots, and sun-scorched uniforms stepped into the holding yard, flanked by silence and suspicion. They pointed, not at her, but at her children. A boy of 12, 2 girls even younger. She froze. One daughter gripped her skirt. The other reached for her brother's hand. But the Americans only nodded to each other, spoke words she didn't understand, and gently motioned the children forward. Her body moved before thought did. She stepped between them, arms wide, voice shaking in broken English. "Please, not my children." They didn't shout. They didn't push. They just lifted the youngest gently into their arms and led them away. And then they were gone. 2 days passed. No word, no answers. She didn't eat, she barely breathed, and when she finally saw them again, what she found shattered every belief she held about war, enemy, and mercy. The sound came first, carried on the dry Philippine wind, a steady rhythm that did not belong to the camp. Boots. Heavy leather boots, striking packed earth with an unfamiliar cadence. She looked up from the ration tin in her hands, her instincts tightening before her mind could catch up. The women around her fell quiet. Even the children, usually restless in the afternoon heat, stilled as if sensing danger. Through the shimmering air beyond the barbed wire, they appeared. 3 American soldiers riding in on horseback, wide-brimmed hats casting hard shadows over their faces. "Cowboys," someone whispered, the word strange and out of place in a world of canvas tents and guard towers. They looked as if they had stepped out of another country, another story entirely, their horses snorting softly, reins creaking, rifles slung but untouched. For a moment she could not move. Her world narrowed to the sight of those men, so different from the American soldiers she had seen before. These were not infantry with helmets and mud-caked boots. These were mounted men, upright and calm, surveying the camp as if it were just another stop on a long road. The visual shock alone stole her breath. Cowboys belonged to films and rumors, not to the reality of captivity. Their presence felt theatrical, deliberate, and deeply wrong. Then one of them pointed, not at her, at her children. Her son, standing tall for his age, tried instinctively to step in front of his sisters. The younger girl clutched her sleeve, fingers digging into the thin fabric of her uniform. The oldest daughter froze, eyes wide, reading the danger in her mother's face. The soldier said something she could not understand, his voice even, almost gentle. Another dismounted, boots sinking slightly into the dust, and walked toward them with slow, careful steps. Her body reacted before thought. She surged forward, heart hammering so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She spread her arms wide, placing herself between the men and her children as if her small frame could shield them from rifles, from fate itself. Words tumbled out in broken English and desperate Japanese, a jumble of pleas she did not know how to translate. "Please? No, my children." Her voice cracked, humiliation and terror braided together so tightly she could not separate them. This was what she had been warned about. This was the moment every lecture, every whispered story had prepared her for. The enemy would not simply kill you, they said. They would take what mattered most. They would strip you of your role, your honor, your future. To lose children in captivity was worse than death. It meant losing face, not just as a soldier or nurse, but as a mother. It meant returning to the ancestors empty-handed, a woman who had failed at the most sacred duty of all. The Americans did not shout. That frightened her more than anger would have. They did not grab her arms or strike her aside. One of them paused, his hand hovering awkwardly in the air, as if unsure how to proceed. Another knelt slightly, lowering himself to the children's level, speaking softly. The tone unsettled her. It was not the voice of a man about to commit violence. It was patient, almost apologetic. Still, when the youngest girl was lifted into unfamiliar arms, something inside her broke loose. She lunged forward, hands clawing at air, a raw sound tearing from her throat. The guards at the perimeter stiffened but did not intervene. No one restrained her. No one explained. The silence was unbearable. Her son looked back over his shoulder as he was guided away, his eyes searching hers for reassurance she could not give. She held his gaze until dust and distance swallowed him whole. In Japanese training manuals, there were instructions for treating wounds, for rationing morphine, for enduring pain without complaint. There were no instructions for watching your children disappear behind a line of foreign soldiers while you stood powerless and alive. That was a humiliation beyond doctrine. Around her, other women looked away, some out of respect, others out of fear that misfortune might notice them next. When the horses turned and carried her children beyond the wire, the camp seemed to tilt. She dropped to her knees in the dust, fists clenched, nails biting into her palms. The world had reduced itself to one certainty. Whatever awaited her children in American hands could only be cruelty. Because mercy, she had been taught, did not exist for the defeated, and if mercy did appear, it was only a lie told before something far worse. She had believed that lie for so long it became a truth carved into her bones. Now, kneeling in the dust, arms empty, she felt the full weight of that belief crashing down, not just because the Americans had taken her children, but because they hadn't hurt her. Not yet. And that delay terrified her more than violence ever could. In the stillness that followed their disappearance, memory returned with the sting of salt in a wound. Not memory of motherhood, but of training, of lectures echoing in the concrete halls of the Imperial Women's Nursing School, where honor was not taught, it was drilled into skin like ink. She had been 19 then, barely out of childhood, when her family offered her to the war. Not as a soldier, not exactly. Women were to serve in other ways, as healers, assistants, providers of care, but also as bearers of loyalty. They were told they were no less warriors than the men on the front lines. Their weapons were scalpels and bandages. Their strength was in silence, discipline, and most of all, endurance. The code they were given was not written in the language of love, but in the blood of sacrifice. Bushido, the ancient warrior code, was reinterpreted for nurses. To surrender was not only shameful, it was a contamination. Better to die clean than live defiled. They were shown grainy films of captured soldiers sobbing in enemy hands. Weakness was uglier than death. And then there were the stories, delivered in hushed tones behind classroom doors and whispered over campfires. What the Americans would do if they caught you. They would strip you, brand you, parade your shame through the streets. But the most terrifying stories were always about the children. "They won't kill your children," one instructor had said, voice flat as stone. "They will take them, raise them to spit on your name. That is the cruelty of the West. They erase, not just destroy." Now that training returned like a fever, every moment after the horses left was consumed by images her mind could not silence. Her son locked in a cage, her daughters forced to scrub floors, foreign hands pulling at their clothes, their hair, their voices crying out for her across oceans she could not cross. She imagined them being renamed, redressed, rewritten. Each minute without them felt like a death sentence, not for their bodies, but for their lineage. Would they forget her? Would they survive, but never speak Japanese again? Inside the infirmary, where she had once administered morphine, she had whispered the oath alongside other women. My life for the Emperor, my silence for the Empire, my body for duty, my children, if taken, will die with my name. The vow had felt like iron then. Now it tasted like ash. No one came to tell her where they had gone. The guards at the fence wouldn't meet her eyes. The other women in the camp avoided her gaze. Some, perhaps, feared that the same fate would find them. Others whispered behind her back, not cruelly, but with pity that stung worse than scorn. She was no longer one of them. She had become something unspeakable, a mother without children, a woman whose body had been spared, but whose soul had already been stolen. She clung to that idea because it made the pain clean. Anger was easier than confusion. Hatred was easier than hope. The Americans were supposed to be monsters. That was the comfort. But as she sat alone that night beneath the rusted corrugated roof of the women's quarters, staring at the spot where her daughters had last slept, another feeling crept in. Not terror, not rage, doubt. And doubt, she realized, was far more dangerous than any enemy she had been trained to fight. The camp did not smell like death. That alone confused her. It smelled of dust and oil, of laundry soap and sweat, and, impossibly, of bread. Not the scorched barley paste that passed for rations back in Japan, but soft, yeasty bread that left a fragrance in the air she could not ignore. The barbed wire was real enough. It coiled like a snake across the perimeter, sharp and gleaming in the tropical sun. Guard towers stood silent but ever present. American soldiers moved along the edges of the compound in pairs, rifles slung across shoulders, boots thudding against the earth. And yet no one shouted, no dogs barked, no punishments echoed from behind barrack walls. The quiet unnerved her more than cruelty would have. Each morning began with a bell, not a whip. The prisoners were not yanked from sleep by screams, but by orderly calls for roll. Food arrived in metal trays, always warm, always enough. The first time it was handed to her, she flinched. Rice, meat, even vegetables. Her fingers refused to reach for the tray. The guard said nothing, only nodded and passed it along. But she could not eat. Not while her children were missing, not while the silence pressed down like a hand on her throat. Days blurred. The sun rose and fell, but time did not move. She sat in the shade of the barrack wall, knees drawn to her chest, eyes fixed on the path where the horses had gone. Her lips moved in silent prayer, not to the Emperor anymore, but to something older, more primal. A mother's plea sent into a world that no longer obeyed the rules she knew. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. Hunger, at least, was familiar. It gave shape to her grief. She drank only when forced. The other women, watching her fade, tried to coax her. One offered a slice of bread from her own tray. Another tried to fold a blanket around her shoulders at night. But their kindness tasted bitter. None of them could bring her children back. They whispered when they thought she slept. She's still not eating. Maybe she's trying to die. But underneath the pity, there was fear. Not just for her, for themselves. Because if the Americans could take one mother's children without warning, without explanation, who would be next? One woman hid her son during morning roll. Another tied her daughter's hair under a cap and called her a boy. They moved through the camp with unease, casting glances at the guards, at each other, at the jungle beyond the wire that offered no escape. The silence inside the camp became contagious. Smiles faded. Conversations turned to murmurs. Trust fractured under the weight of uncertainty. At night, she lay awake listening to the soft clatter of utensils from the mess hall, the faint notes of a harmonica, Someone played beneath a tree, the murmuring of guards speaking English too quickly for her to understand. Her bed, though soft, felt like a betrayal. The pillow held the smell of starch and unfamiliarity. The blanket scratched her skin. Comfort in this place was not a gift. It was a weapon, a way to make you forget what had been taken. The sun moved slowly across the sky. She counted the days by the wear on her fingernails, by the number of meals she refused. She no longer knew what day it was, only that it had been too many. The guards walked by, sometimes glancing in her direction. One of them, a young man with a crooked smile, paused once, opened his mouth, and then kept walking. He said nothing. That was worse than cruelty. Cruelty she could understand. In her old life she had been taught to prepare the dying for burial. Now she prepared herself, not for death, but for erasure. Her name was still known to her. But if her children forgot it, what would be left? What would she be? And in that question, her fear turned to something colder: resolve. She would not break, not until she saw them, not until she could look into their eyes and know if the stories had been lies or if they had come true. On the morning of the third day, the light crept slowly across the barrack floor, painting long golden bars across her ankles. She did not move. She had not moved much in 2 days. Her body was weak, her limbs hollowed by silence and hunger, but her eyes remained sharp, fixed on the edge of the world just beyond the wire. That was when she saw him, a figure not in uniform, but in khakis and a cap far too large for his head. He walked with a clipboard tucked under his arm and hesitated near the women's compound. One of the guards gestured toward her. The boy stepped forward. His face was Japanese. He spoke slowly. His accent was strange, a clipped American rhythm hiding beneath familiar vowels. "I am translator," he said, bowing slightly. "Your children, they are alive." She blinked, but the words did not land. He waited, then tried again. "No hurt. They were not taken as prisoners. Civilian center. Better food, better place." His voice was calm, soft in a way that made her want to scream, as if 3 days of torment could be erased with a few gentle syllables. "Why?" she rasped, the word torn from a throat that had spoken nothing in nearly 40 hours. Her lips cracked as she formed it. "Why them?" He glanced down at the clipboard. "Children are young, not soldiers, Americans. They have policy. Separate camps for civilians. They are safe." He said it again. Safe, as if it meant something real. She stared at him, searching his eyes for the lie. But there was no cruelty in his face, only a kind of careful sadness, like someone who had delivered this message before. "Take me," she whispered. "I see." There was a long pause. The boy nodded once, then spoke to the guards in English. She could not understand their reply, but a moment later one of them stepped forward and motioned for her to follow. She expected shackles. She expected a blindfold. Instead, they gave her a wide straw hat to shield her from the sun and a canteen of cool water. She clutched the metal like it was the last possession she owned. The walk to the civilian center took nearly half an hour, down a dirt road lined with banana trees and buzzing with insects. Her escort said nothing, though once he handed her a small square of dried fruit. She held it in her palm without eating it. When they arrived, she did not recognize the place. There were no fences, no barbed wire. Children ran barefoot across open grass, chasing a red rubber ball. Laundry flapped from wooden posts. A young American woman in a blue skirt stood outside a shaded building, reading to a cluster of children in both English and Japanese. The smell of food, real food, drifted on the air. She wavered, dizzy from shock, and then she saw them. Her son, standing taller than she remembered, was seated at a wooden table, carefully writing something with a pencil in a workbook. One daughter was beside him, hair neatly tied back, humming softly as she colored. The youngest was asleep in a cot nearby, a doll tucked beneath one arm. Their skin was clean, their faces full, their cheeks rounder than they had been when they left her. No bruises, no filth, no fear. She staggered forward, and the translator caught her elbow. "They are learning," he said gently. "They eat 3 times. They sleep in real beds. Teachers, nurses, care." Tears blurred her vision. Not from relief, not yet, from confusion. How could this be real? Her son looked up and saw her, his eyes lighting up like dawn itself. He shouted her name, not mother, but her given name, the one he only used when teasing. She dropped to her knees, and the children ran to her, arms flung wide. The ground was warm beneath her palms. Her daughter pressed a drawing into her hand, a house with a garden, a woman with long black hair, a horse, and 3 smiling children. For the first time since the war began, she laughed, and then, just as quickly, she began to weep. Not because she feared the enemy, but because for the first time she no longer knew who the enemy truly was. Her youngest daughter broke free first, arms flung wide, feet kicking up dust as she ran, laughing with a sound that felt almost impossible in this place. The child collided with her chest, small hands clutching fabric as if to anchor herself, and for a moment the world narrowed to warmth, breath, and the steady thump of a living heart. The girl smelled of soap, real soap, not the sour scent of sweat and fear that had followed them through the last months of retreat. Her hair was clean, tied neatly with a strip of cloth, her skin soft beneath her mother's trembling fingers. She was alive, undamaged, laughing. The boy approached more carefully, as if unsure whether this reunion was real or another dream that might vanish if touched too quickly. He held out a folded piece of paper with both hands, solemn as a gift offering. When she opened it, the lines wavered before her eyes. A horse stood at the center of the page, large and proud, its mane scribbled thick and dark. Beside it were 3 smaller figures holding hands, and above them a sun drawn too big for the sky. "They let us see them," he said, voice steady but bright. "The horses. The men wear funny hats and let us feed them apples." Apples? The word struck her harder than any blow. She had not tasted fruit in months. She swallowed, throat tight, and forced herself to listen. They spoke all at once, words tumbling over each other, each detail more unsettling than the last. They had beds, real beds with blankets that smelled like flowers. They had shoes that fit, not the cracked sandals they had marched in. A woman read to them every morning, teaching them letters in Japanese and English. They were given bowls of soup so full they could not finish them. There was milk. There was bread that was soft even the next day. Her oldest daughter proudly demonstrated a song she had learned, humming shyly, glancing up for approval. "They have a dog," the youngest announced, eyes wide. "A big one. He sleeps outside, but he lets me touch his ears." A dog. An American dog. The idea alone would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. She looked at their faces as they spoke, searching desperately for signs of harm she had been trained to expect. Fear, confusion, something broken behind the eyes. But there was none of it. Instead, she saw color returning to their cheeks, curiosity sparking where exhaustion once lived. They were not silent. They were not withdrawn. They were alive in a way she had not seen since before the bombings. Her hands moved over them instinctively, checking arms, shoulders, hairlines, as if still searching for wounds. The boy laughed softly. "Mother," he said gently, "we are fine. Fine." The word did not belong to war. It did not belong to captivity. It shattered against everything she had been taught. For the first time she cried without covering her face. The tears came fast and hot, blurring the edges of the world. But these were not tears of terror or rage. They were heavy with confusion. Because if the enemy was supposed to destroy, then why were her children being rebuilt? If surrender meant humiliation, why did her son stand taller than he had in months? If Americans were monsters, why did her daughters speak of them with laughter? She remembered the words drilled into her during training. They will erase you. They will take what you love and make it unrecognizable. Yet here her children were. Changed, yes, but not erased. Strengthened, fed, educated. Their names still theirs, their language still alive on their tongues. As she held them close, the foundations of her world began to crack. Not loudly, not all at once, but quietly, like ice breaking beneath still water. She realized with a jolt that the greatest danger was no longer the Americans beyond the wire. It was the realization forming inside her, that the stories she had lived by might not have been lies exactly, but something worse. They were incomplete. And once a belief begins to fracture, no amount of training can fully repair it. The pencil felt heavier than any surgical instrument she had ever held. It was short, its yellow paint chipped, the tip already dulled from use. Yet when the translator placed it gently in her palm, her fingers trembled as if it were a weapon. The paper followed, plain, thin, blank. A silence settled around her that felt deeper than the jungle night. "You may write," the young man said softly. "Your husband, your family, 1 page." He hesitated, then added almost apologetically, "It will be checked, but it will be sent." For a long moment she did not move. Writing home had never been part of the stories. Letters from captivity were supposed to be impossible. Words were not meant to cross enemy lines unless they were forced confessions or propaganda. She had prepared herself for death, for silence, even for shame. She had not prepared herself to speak. She sat at a narrow wooden table in the resettlement compound, her children nearby, quietly occupied with colored pencils and books. The normalcy of it all felt obscene. A mother writing a letter while her children drew pictures, guarded not by threats but by routine. Her hand hovered above the page, the pencil tip trembling, as though the paper might recoil from the truth she was about to lay upon it. She began with his name. Writing it felt like reopening a wound that had never closed. Somewhere, she knew, he was still wearing his uniform, still believing what she had believed, that the enemy was merciless, that surrender was erasure, that captivity meant degradation beyond survival. Each word she placed on the page felt like a betrayal of that shared belief, and yet to lie now felt worse. "I am alive," she wrote first, the characters uneven, her hand unsteady. She paused, breathing through the tightness in her chest. Alive was not a word she had expected to use. "The children are alive," she continued. Her pencil pressed harder into the paper, leaving faint grooves. "They were taken from me, but not harmed." She stopped there, staring at the sentence as if it belonged to someone else. Taken, but not harmed. The contradiction made her dizzy. "They feed our children," she wrote next, slower now, every stroke deliberate. "They sleep in beds, they learn letters, they laugh." Her eyes blurred, and she wiped them with the heel of her hand, smudging a tear across the margin. "The Americans are kind," she added, the words small and almost ashamed. Then, after a long pause, she finished with the only honest ending she could find. "I do not understand this war any more." When she set the pencil down, her fingers ached as if she had been gripping it for hours. The translator collected the page without comment. He did not smile. He did not reassure her. He simply nodded, as though he understood that this letter carried a weight far beyond ink and paper. Her letter would join others, letters from nurses, from auxiliaries, from soldiers who had survived surrender, and dared to describe it honestly. Together they formed a quiet threat. Not a rebellion, but something more corrosive: doubt. For those who read them, there would be no reply, no comfort sent back. Silence would be the safest answer. In the camp, days passed without response. She watched her children grow calmer, more secure, their fears slowly unwinding. She returned to her own compound each evening, crossing back through the invisible line that separated safety from uncertainty. Other women began to ask her questions in hushed tones. Are they really fed? Do they touch them? Do they cry at night? She answered truthfully, though each answer felt like another crack spreading through the walls of belief that still surrounded them. At night, she lay awake imagining her husband receiving nothing. No letter, no proof of life. She wondered if he still pictured her as dead, or worse, dishonored. She wondered if, somewhere, he was fighting harder because of that belief. The thought made her chest ache. Writing had not brought relief. It had only widened the distance between the world she now inhabited and the one she had left behind. And yet, even as guilt pressed down on her, she knew she would write again if given the chance. Because once the truth has been written, even softly, it cannot be unwritten. And somewhere beyond the wire, beyond the war, beyond the silence imposed by men who feared it, those words were already beginning to do their quiet, irreversible work. The request came without ceremony. No order barked, no threat implied. A guard approached her one afternoon and gestured toward the infirmary tent at the far end of the compound. A translator followed, hands folded neatly in front of him. "They need help," he said. "You were trained. It is voluntary." The word lingered between them, foreign and unsettling. Voluntary. In her world, there had been no such thing. Work was duty. Duty was survival. To refuse was unthinkable. And yet here she was, being asked, not commanded. She followed them slowly, heart pounding with a fear she could not name. The infirmary smelled of alcohol and clean cloth, a scent that pulled her backward through years of training and blood-soaked nights. Inside, American medics moved with practiced efficiency, sleeves rolled up, voices low, hands steady. They tended to wounds without urgency or contempt, bandaging Japanese prisoners alongside their own injured men. No distinctions, no hierarchy of worth. Pain was pain, blood was blood. She stood awkwardly at the entrance, unsure where to place herself, when an older American doctor looked up. He studied her face for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You're a nurse, aren't you?" he asked, his English slow and clear. The translator echoed the words in Japanese, but she hardly heard him. The word nurse struck her like a physical blow. Not prisoner, not enemy. Nurse, a role, a calling, an identity that existed before the war and, somehow, after it. "Yes," she whispered, surprised that her voice did not break. The doctor nodded as if this confirmed something he had already assumed. He handed her a clean apron, freshly laundered, still warm from the sun, then a small bottle of antiseptic. "You can help clean wounds," he said, "if you want." If you want. Again, the choice cut deeper than any command. She tied the apron around her waist with trembling hands, feeling as though she were stepping into another life. As the hours passed, she found herself doing what she had been trained to do, cleaning cuts, changing dressings, offering water. Her hands remembered the motions even as her mind reeled. She watched American medics pause to explain procedures to prisoners who did not share their language, using gestures and patience instead of force. She saw them comfort a young Japanese man shaking from fever, murmuring reassurances though he could not understand the words. No blows, no threats, just care. In her training, efficiency had been prized above compassion. Wounded men were triaged quickly. Those unlikely to survive were left behind without ceremony. Mercy was considered wasteful. Resources belonged to the strong. Here, she watched an American doctor spend nearly an hour stitching a wound on a prisoner who would never return to battle. "He deserves to heal," the doctor said simply when she asked why. Deserves. The word lodged in her chest. The shock was not loud. It unfolded quietly, moment by moment, as she moved between cots and tables. She realized she was being trusted, not watched closely, not tested, trusted. That trust weighed on her heavier than chains ever could have. It demanded something of her in return, something she did not yet know how to give. When the shift ended, the doctor thanked her. Thanked her. He did not interrogate her, did not demand information, did not ask about her loyalty. He simply thanked her for her work and told her she could return the next day if she wished. As she untied the apron, folding it neatly, she felt a strange ache behind her eyes. She was not sure when she had last been thanked for anything. That night, lying on her bunk, she replayed the day in fragments. The clean cloth, the steady hands, the word nurse spoken without irony. Seeds of doubt settled deep within her, taking root in soil softened by experience rather than ideology. If the enemy could heal without hatred, then what did that say about the war she had served? What did it say about the values she had been taught to defend? She did not yet have answers, only questions. And for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder whether those questions were not a betrayal, but the beginning of something like truth. It began as a sound so out of place. She thought for a moment it must be imagined. A single high note, drawn out like a question, then a ripple of melody, low and bright, weaving through the heat-thickened air. She turned toward the wire, squinting through the shimmer rising off the dust. There, under the shade of a mango tree, an American soldier sat on a wooden crate, a harmonica pressed to his lips. His boots were unlaced. His rifle leaned against the tree, untouched. He played with eyes half closed, fingers tapping gently on the metal casing, like a man remembering a tune from long before war. From across the wire, her children heard it too. Her youngest tilted her head and began to hum, barely louder than a breath. The boy listened, then joined in, matching the notes with a quiet, instinctive grace. It was a lullaby, not Japanese, not American, something simpler, older, a song without words, meant only to soothe. Other children gathered, drawn by the novelty of it all. Some began swaying, one clapped off beat. Laughter followed, real, bubbling, unforced, and for a moment it didn't feel like a prison camp at all. She stood frozen, heart thudding, as the soldier looked up and caught her gaze. He didn't stop playing, he just nodded. A silent acknowledgement, not of forgiveness or friendship, but of shared humanity. She turned away quickly, blinking hard. Something about the moment frightened her more than threats ever had. Music had crossed the wire. So had laughter, and neither had asked for permission. She found herself caught between two realities. One was the world she had known, loyalty, fear, vigilance. The other was this strange limbo where enemies behaved like neighbors, where the sound of a harmonica could turn strangers into an audience. She watched her children adjust effortlessly. They laughed with staff, asked for seconds, and brought home stories of goats, new books, and the names of American nurses. They were adapting. They were thriving. But for her, each smile they wore twisted like a knot inside her. Guilt bloomed in quiet, private corners of her heart. What would her husband think if he saw their daughter petting a dog raised by Americans? What would her old commanders say if they saw her boy sitting at a table across from a U.S. officer, trading words in broken English and sketches of horses? Had she failed them by surviving? Or had she only now begun to see clearly? At night, she lay on the thin cot and stared at the canvas ceiling above, listening to the hum of insects and the occasional distant laugh. She thought about the oath she had taken years ago, to serve without question, to resist to the end. But no one had told her what to do when the end felt so quiet, so kind. The children were already slipping into this new world, unburdened by ideology, innocent enough to accept peace when it was offered. She envied them, their simplicity, their ability to feel joy without permission. Her own joy felt dangerous, like a betrayal. And yet, when the harmonica played again the next afternoon, she found herself humming too, barely, just beneath her breath, so softly no one would notice. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't surrender, it was something else. A quiet, uncertain step into a space between. If you've made it this far in the story, let us know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and hit the like button if this story moved you. The announcement came without ceremony, pinned to a notice board near the administration tent, written in careful Japanese and clipped English. Repatriation. The word rippled through the camp like a held breath finally released. After months behind wire and watchtowers, the war had shifted again. They were going home. When the translator told her, his voice measured and calm, she felt no rush of joy, only a strange tightening in her chest, as if something she had learned to rely on was about to vanish. The camp gathered itself quietly. There were no cheers, no celebrations. Goodbyes here were awkward, subdued, heavy with things that could not be said. An American nurse pressed a small parcel into her hands, extra bandages, soap, a tin of biscuits wrapped carefully in paper. "For the children," she said. The doctor who had worked beside her in the infirmary nodded once, his expression unreadable. No speeches, no apologies, just the quiet acknowledgment of shared time that would never be repeated. Her children packed eagerly, excitement sparking in their voices. They spoke in half-formed English phrases now, mixing words without realizing it. "Mama, look," her son said, pointing to a sign, translating it aloud with pride. He was taller than when they had arrived, his shoulders straighter, his eyes clearer. The girls clutched their few belongings, a ribbon, a book, a wooden toy. The youngest insisted on bringing the drawing of the horse, now creased and smudged from being folded and unfolded too many times. When the day came, they were marched not to punishment, but to transport trucks. The road out of the camp felt unreal. The barbed wire receded behind them, replaced by open fields and distant hills. She looked back once, catching sight of the mango tree where the harmonica had played. For a fleeting moment, she felt something like grief. The camp had been a prison. It had also been a place where her children were fed, where her hands were trusted to heal, where the enemy had spoken to her as a human being. At the port, the repatriation ship waited, its hull towering, its paint worn but steady. The sky above was pale and quiet, empty of aircraft, empty of sirens. As they climbed the gangplank, she felt the weight of the few things she carried. There were only 3 she had kept, her children, close enough that she could feel their warmth. The folded drawing of the horse, tucked carefully into her bag, and the blanket, thick, clean, stamped faintly with American markings, the one given to her the night she had collapsed from exhaustion in the infirmary. She had not planned to keep it. She simply could not leave it behind. On deck, the children leaned over the railing, eyes wide at the endless water. "Is this America still?" her daughter asked. She shook her head gently. "No," she said. "This is between." The answer surprised her even as she spoke it. Between. That was where she now lived, between who she had been and who she had become. That night, as the ship cut steadily through the dark water, she stood on deck wrapped in the blanket, the wind cool against her face. The children slept below, tangled together in shared bunks. She watched the stars, thinking of all the versions of herself she had been. A nurse sworn to obedience, a prisoner consumed by fear, a mother on her knees in the dust, a healer working beside the enemy. She realized she was no longer just one thing. She was a mother, yes, that had never changed. But she was also a survivor, carrying memories that did not fit neatly into victory or defeat. And more than that, she was a witness. To kindness where none was expected, to mercy where only cruelty had been promised, to a truth that would be difficult to speak and perhaps even harder to live with. As the ship sailed on, she closed her eyes and held that knowledge quietly, knowing the hardest part of her journey was not the war she had endured, but the peace she was about to return to. Japan greeted them with silence and ruin. The harbor was intact enough to receive ships, but beyond it stretched a landscape she barely recognized. Buildings stood like broken teeth against the sky. Smoke still lingered in places where fires had burned themselves out weeks earlier. As they disembarked, no bands played. No officials welcomed them home. The return was orderly, efficient, and utterly devoid of celebration. This was not a nation receiving heroes. It was a nation counting losses. The journey to her village took days, by crowded train cars and long stretches on foot. Along the way, her children stared wide-eyed at the devastation, their excitement fading into quiet confusion. When they finally reached the place she had once called home, there was nothing left to recognize. The house was gone, reduced to scorched beams and scattered tiles. The well had collapsed. The small garden where her daughters once played was nothing but ash and weeds. She stood there for a long time, saying nothing, the weight of absence pressing against her chest. No one asked how the children had survived. No one asked what they had seen. The unspoken assumption was enough. To have lived was already questionable. To have lived well was unforgivable. They were given space in a relative's home, a single room with tatami mats, patched and worn. At night, as air raid sirens echoed faintly in memory if not in sound, she lay awake, listening to her children breathe. They slept deeply, untroubled, their bellies full even in scarcity, their bodies strong. The youngest curled against her side, clutching the blanket she had brought across the ocean. The American blanket. She had hesitated before unpacking it, knowing what it represented. In the end, she spread it anyway, folding it carefully so its markings were hidden. During the day, she tried to teach them how to behave as they once had, to lower their eyes, to speak softly, to forget certain words. But the children had changed. They said, "Thank you," more often. They shared food without being told. Her son asked questions, dangerous questions, about why some had plenty and others nothing, about why enemies could be kind. She had no answers that would keep him safe. The kindness she had witnessed could not be spoken of openly. There was no space for it here. Japan was too raw, too wounded. Mercy complicated grief. It blurred the lines that people clung to for meaning, and yet she saw that kindness alive in her children, in the way they offered help, in the way they did not flinch at loud voices, in the way they believed the world could still be gentle. That was the different kind of wound she carried now, not shrapnel, not hunger, but knowledge. Knowledge that contradicted what her country needed to believe in order to heal. Knowledge that the enemy had not taken her children to erase them, but to preserve them. That they had been fed when she could not feed them, sheltered when she could not shelter them, dignified when she herself had been stripped of dignity by her own people's silence. One night, long after the children had fallen asleep, she sat beside them, watching their chests rise and fall in the dim light. She traced the outline of the horse drawing with her finger, its lines softened by time. She thought of the cowboys on horseback, the harmonica drifting across the wire, the doctor who had called her a nurse. She thought of the moment her children had been taken from her arms, and the moment they had been returned. "They took my children," she whispered into the darkness, the words barely audible. Then, after a pause, she finished the thought she had carried across oceans and years. "And they gave them back whole." That truth would never be carved into monuments. It would not appear in textbooks or victory speeches. It would live quietly, passed down in gestures, in values, in the way her children would one day raise their own. Mercy, she now understood, was not loud. It did not announce itself, but it endured. If this story resonated with you, please like the video and share in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every view helps us keep these forgotten stories alive.